All right, so everybody can hear me okay, I think. I get at least one thumbs up out there. I got laughs. Okay, thumbs up is good. All right, so I'm tasked with continuing the work that Mariah did a couple weeks ago, and so I'm here. I'm gonna try to workshop as best I can with all of us, even though some of us are remote, and I'll pay attention as best I can. So some things here that I want to, oh yeah, I can put you at the bottom. So I wondered if anybody had any questions. So Mariah and I were working off of the same kind of 5 objectives, and Mariah covered these 2 really in depth. And so I wondered if anybody needed anything based on what they learned a couple weeks ago.
I have a comment just on if we had the assignment to do both of those, do a logic model and do a theory of change. My logic model ended up looking like a lot like my theory of change, and I wasn't maybe sure if maybe I'd just forgotten how they're different a little bit. Maybe a little clarification. I mean, just since we're getting back up to speed on that, so. I don't know, my logic model had a lot of the boxes and arrows. I included the assumptions and things like that, but yeah.
Yeah, I can talk about that. Yeah. So if you can't hear his question, it was like, how do theories of change and logic models differ? And sometimes they do look the same. So don't like beat yourself up about that, because they really can. So the way that I use a theory of change differently than a logic model is I use a theory of change for my overall program and a logic model for each individual project that I do. And so my overall program is to try to get people to adopt integrated pest management all throughout the West. And I do that with various different projects. So we have projects in urban agriculture and projects in bed bug, like alleviation and pesticide reduction. And so each of those projects would have a logic model. But it is logical to have the end of the logic model, that long-term impact piece, be part of it should be part of the theory of change. So your theory of change, like our theory of change at the Western IPM Center is to, improve the environment. So we want to reduce the amount of pesticides in water. And so that should show up both in the long-term impacts of each project's logic model, because it lives in my overall theory of change. Does that help?
That helps a lot.
And for trellis, it might be that when organizations are small, like all of our trellis organizations are, they can just end up doing projects that are very much aligned with their program, right? And so their logic models and theories of change could actually look very similar, because maybe they don't have a diverse portfolio, or maybe they're not tackling a giant issue that has a lot of different pieces to it. So yeah, so it's okay. And theories of change can look, some of them are very artsy. Some of them are very logical, like a logic model. Good question. Does anybody else have a question?
Yeah. Are logic models and monitoring and evaluation plans kind of?
Right. Well, I knew Mariah. Oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was asking.
Oh, we can't actually hear you. I can see him talking though.
You might have to turn up the volume on.
Oh, on mine. Or on you.
Yeah, try that. Oh wait, he muted himself.
Oh, you muted yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So are logic frameworks and monitoring and evaluation plans kind of an interchangeable word or name? Because it seems like sometimes I see logic framework and it looks like a monitoring and evaluation plan.
So that is very confusing, and we are not very, so as evaluators, we're not very good at being super clear with we try to keep it all a secret. So yeah, so they're not interchangeable, but they do often look similar, okay? So what I want to teach you today is to take your logic model, and then you would create the monitoring and evaluation plan alongside it. And so what I'm seeing recently in the work that I've been doing, or that I've seen other people do, is they have their logic model and the list of, let's see, I know I have one here. Maybe I'll steal yours. So they have their logic model and their list of things, and then underneath they write the plan. So how they'll evaluate each of these outputs, and the decisions they'll make based on their evaluation. So maybe one of your outputs is to train 100 people, but you only get 10 people trained, right? The monitoring and evaluation plan enables you to make a decision at that point that says either we add another training or we messed up something and we weren't able, and we have to readjust. And so I see it as complementary, but you could make a all-encompassing logic model that had all of those pieces together. Yeah, and you do see some organizations do it, but when I made the evaluation plan for the Western IPM Center, I presented it to I have an advisory board, and they don't know anything about evaluation, and my monitoring and evaluation plan was 36 pages, and it scared them. So, and they instantly rejected it, and so I reformatted it and put it into something more like a logic model to make it better for them. So sometimes as an evaluator, you have to think about your audience better. Yeah.
Russell, I think for the purpose of Trellis right now, we are thinking of them as separate just because we shared that 3-page document with you, one that was the monitoring evaluation plan template. And the third page on that was the logic model, logical framework. So just for Trellis right now, we're thinking of them as separate, but I think Amanda makes a good point that they could be combined into one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I did it that way. It's just in looking at it and asking people around me that have done these things, oftentimes we were getting mixed up. But that it was pretty clear. I just wanted to make sure that I had it right.
Yeah. Okay, good. Any other questions? No, she's awesome. Okay, go Mariah. Okay, so what we're gonna do today, so we did, Mariah did those first pieces. So what I'm going to talk about is outputs and outcomes, and designing measures to measure our outputs and outcomes. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about facilitating a monitoring and evaluation workshop, because if you were to become a professional evaluator, that's very much a skill that our profession relies on. So an evaluator we have 9 principles. We're kind of like doctors. We pledge to uphold these 9 principles, and one of them is to not do monitoring and evaluation planning without our stakeholders present. So, and there's some really good books on facilitating monitoring, evaluation, and planning. And I know that you are going to turn in a monitoring and evaluation plan, and that hopefully you've been chatting with your Trellis organization. But once you get there, it's always worth sitting down with them again and making sure that nothing was lost over the internet. So we'll do that, and then we'll troubleshoot any problems that you have. And so I have all of the same things that were sent to you. So just a little bit about outputs and outcomes, and you should have had these in your draft logic model. Outcomes measure change, whereas outputs are the data collected that help us measure that change. And in my field of study, and so lots of different fields of study do this differently, but in integrative pest management, we try to think about change in 3 ways. So we always term short-term change as a knowledge change. So you're able to change somebody's knowledge. We do that in school all the time. That's what we're doing right now, is changing knowledge. And then we tend to say that medium-term change is the adoption of that knowledge. So somebody putting knowledge into practice. So for us, today we're learning about monitoring and evaluation. And if I'm making a medium-term change in your life, then you will actually go out and do it, try it out at least once. And then long-term change is something that we see as a condition change. So it could be that your project is more successful because you learned about monitoring evaluation and applied it. In integrated pest management, our long-term change is, a positive change in water quality, maybe, or reduction of pesticides. And so whenever we're looking at outcomes, that's how we frame it. And I like that as a starting point. It doesn't have to be the way you would do it forever, but I think it kind of helps to think about knowledge change, behavior change, and then condition change as you move through.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, for example, for a long outcome, this saying that there's improved food security, is that an outcome, or is that like way out of there, it's not the outcome, it's kind of like the goal?
It could be. Increased food security is definitely a long-term.
Okay.
Yeah. And one thing that is, as you develop a logic model, you may not be able to measure that long-term change, right? Because your project might be only a year in length, or it might take other projects to build that long-term change. And that's perfectly okay. What we'd like to see in projects is definite measure of short-term change. And if you have a long enough project, a measure of medium-term change. And what I like to see is are the data collected at the beginning of a project that in 30 years you could go back and monitor and see if the long-term change took place. And so when you're developing a monitoring and evaluation plan, I think it's worth, so if we're talking about food security, it would be great if in 2018 you had a measure of food security, so that if after this project takes place and you teach someone a technology and they adopt it, then you could do another survey and understand, is there long-term output? And too often we don't do that. So we set these aspirational goals of long-term impacts without measuring the baseline. And I think it's worth a little bit of money in projects to at least have a baseline, but there has to be a plan for managing those data so that they don't get lost somewhere. Yeah. Good questions. Okay, so outputs are the data we collect. So they will go into your M&E framework. And we're going to talk about different ways that you can collect data, but they should also logically feed into an outcome. So if I want to assess so if my long-term, or if one of my outcomes is reduction in pesticide applications, then maybe some of the outputs I would measure are number of people who attend a meeting, number of people who adopt the technology, number of people who, reduce pesticide, like pounds of pesticides sold in the market. So those are all data points that I could collect that all make sense to reducing pesticide use. But we'll go over these really well too. So here, I made one. Okay, so our intended outcome, this is my intended outcome for you, is to increase the trellis students' knowledge of monitoring and evaluation. So what do you think I should keep track of if I wanted to know whether you guys knew more about M&E tomorrow than you did
survey us about our baseline knowledge about M&E.
Survey about baseline knowledge of M&E. Yep, I could do that. What else could I do?
Could look at our monitoring evaluation plans once we're finished with them.
I could do that. I could look at your monitoring and I could grade them. Just like some of this is very pertinent to school, right? You think about how teachers assess you in school.
What are the assessments? What are the factors that control that control the monitoring and evaluation? What factors needs to be assessed?
Right. So maybe I want to know if you know the difference between outputs and outcomes, right? I could give you a quick little quiz on that tomorrow. That would be, yeah, you're right. Which factors, what are the skill set, the knowledge that you need to do M&E, and then do you know it? So I could do a quiz. So yeah, so you've got the hang of it.
What about engagement, like participation? Is that more of an output?
It's more of an output because it's difficult to measure. Yeah, I mean, you could measure engagement and have that be a proxy for people having better knowledge about something. You might have, yeah, definitely. If you were sitting here on your cell phones, I would pretty much assume that you don't know, that you're not going to know how many. Right, so it's really simple. Like, it seems like that should be too simple, right? But it's totally like outputs and measuring outcomes are not as hard as, not as scary as we think they are. So I could have, here's some that I came up with. I could have taken a % of Trellis students who pass the test. That's what we do in school. I could give you a pre-post test like you recommended and see how people improve, or just like you said, I could do a qualitative score or grade of your logic model. So yeah, so you got them all. Easy peasy. All right, so I'm gonna make us smaller. So here's just an example of outputs versus outcomes, and this comes from a project that is on improving women's access to care in shelters. And so an output, so I always think about outputs as numbers, like numbers of things, score of things, like even interviews can be numbers, right? And so an output would be the number of women and children admitted to shelters. And that leads kind of to this outcome of understanding how many people are accessing shelter services. So say we have a baseline of, we know how many homeless people are in our city, and we keep track over time based on our intervention if the number of men and women admitted to shelters goes up. So that would be one way to measure. We could survey women and children who were turned away from shelters, and that could be a number, and then look at a qualitative aspect of that and ask why. And that would inform our outcomes. We could look at the number of women that we taught about their legal rights and options, or the number of women attending support groups, or the number of women accessing childcare and support. And all of those things should map onto, and they might not be one for one, like it might not be this output measures completely onto this outcome, but it might be the combination of those outputs, the measure onto these outcomes. But so our whole outcome, these are the things we want, are a proportion of women and children accessing shelter services that are safer. So we could measure that with a couple of these outputs. Women having increased awareness of impact violence. That could be from the number of women attending support groups or people understanding their legal rights. Women feel less isolated. We could get that from support groups. Women have better housing, and women achieve the goals they've set for themselves. So, and one thing I like about the thing we came up with for trellis is that it talks about, so in this M&E framework, it talks about how we define an output, what the baseline of it is, what we dream of it being, and then how we'll measure it. It looks like am I still alive there?
Yes. I think it's just the connection.
Oh, there's a chat.
Yeah.
Oh, to the TV?
Do you want to try reconnecting to the TV the same way? The code changed it.
Oh.
Yeah, so I just minimized your internet.
Oh, do I have to do that again?
I'm not sure.
No, it's fine. This is technology.
Well, I could try 6885 because I have the code. Yeah, so I think I might be like a step ahead.
Okay, sorry, we're having, hold on, I have to, oops. Ah. Zoom meeting. This is so much better than it used to be, everybody. So when I was in charge of Trellis. So my desktop. All right. So we're back. You're back. Sweet. Okay. Hey, I've gone too far. Okay. So, all right. Now, so in an M&E plan, you already assess what the baseline is, what your goal is, how you will measure it, how often, who's responsible, and where you will report it. And what I had Asha and Lauren send you was some of the things I had them send you were performance indicator reference sheets. I think I had sent you 2 or 3. All right. So did you all see these? They're kind of different. Yeah, and we have some copies here. And so this is something that I like to develop as I'm trying to understand which output or which indicator I need to measure. And unfortunately, in development projects or in any kind of project, we don't have like $1 million to just throw at monitoring and evaluation. And unfortunately, very often, monitoring and evaluation gets like $0, which should not be the case. I think it should be at least 20% of a project, but I am in the minority there. So you have to think about the things you can measure, like the things you have the tools to measure. Like I was talking earlier about environmental quality, and I might not even own water quality testing tools, right? So you have to think about all the things that you have. And so here's a guidance over developing a performance indicator. And an indicator is just, this is another terminology we did to you, but you can have an indicator of an output or an indicator of an outcome. So an indicator should be direct, so it should clearly measure the result. So if I were to give you a test, the test questions that I ask you should clearly measure your ability to tell me that you've learned something. And I wouldn't want to test for pesticides with, you know, a test that tested nitrogen, right? So it should be clear. It should be objective, so the test should measure what, should not be ambiguous about what's being measured, and you should be able to know that the data you collected makes sense. And some of this is very much like science. So what I see in my work is that scientists do a really remarkable job of measuring science. So we know if a pesticide kills a plant. We know, and we have good ways of testing that. And that's all this is just like that. It's using the things we have to test a hypothesis. And our hypothesis is just about the project instead of about the experiment. The indicator should be useful. It should help somebody make a decision. So it should be something that if you gathered those data, somebody would be able to use those data to make a decision. It should be attributable. So you should be able to say that your program made a difference in some way. It should be practical. That gets back to the money. So you don't want to do, if your project is only 1 year long, you can't do the monitoring of that project for 6 months of that project. That's just unreasonable. It should be adequate, which means that you can have a group of indicators that can measure the overall objective. You don't have to overmeasure. And if possible, you should be able to disaggregate different things, whether it's by gender or age or location or something else. The more disaggregation you put in an indicator, the richer your data are. So you can understand if certain people are adopting your technology or not and why. You can look for red flags, like maybe women are not adopting this technology. Overall, the population, it looks like we're being successful, but women are not adopting this technology. And so what I gave you were performance indicator reference sheets. And what these do is they help you and your team, even if you're a one-man show, a one-man team, they help you keep on track. They allow for multiple people to collect data, and they help keep your data accurate. So the three I gave you were, we'll start with this one that's called number of individuals who received USG, which is US government, supported short-term agricultural sector productivity or food security training. So that's my output. That's the thing I'm measuring, is number of people essentially who are doing short-term training. Now, can you think of all the ways that if I walked into this room and said, Lauren, go and measure the number of people who received US government supported short-term agricultural sector productivity or food security training. And then I said it to, what's your name? Carla. Would you be able to collect the same data, do you think?
Your access to different data sources
might be different, or the way that you define short-term might be different from the way that Carla does, or the way that you define food security might be different from the way she does. And so what this performance indicator reference sheet does is it helps kind of normalize the data collection. And it also helps you, like if you did a survey and then 2 years later wanted to pick it up again, you would know what it is you had collected. So no two performance indicator reference sheets are the same. In this one, it defines, it says there's no predefined minimum or maximum length of time for training. So that means that it could be as long as it could be a day or an hour or a year. So they're not picky. I have seen some where it's like short-term training is anything less than 6 months. It says you can count an individual only once, regardless of the number of trainings they received during the reporting year. And I've also seen ones that say if a person learns something different, then you could count them twice as 2 people, right? So, and again, like if by writing this down, then you have the rules. And essentially, these are the rules for each output. It goes on to talk about which kinds of things are included in agriculture, but it says it should not include nutrition-related training. So on the back, it talks about where you would get your data source, how often you would collect it, who the person is that's responsible. Some of these things, again, go into our M&E framework. So these are just tools that we have to.
This is the same method of data.
It should.
It does, but there's like a blank.
Oh, really? Oh, this is one we didn't finish. Eee, oh, look at that. This project that this comes from is a project that is complicated and wrought with frustration. Yep, you're right. I would be like it would be like maybe sign-in sheets at trainings, registrations. That's how I would do it. Yeah, good call. See how and that's why having this like nice matrix is going to help us. It has some of these components, right? It talks about the baseline, the target, the data, how it will be measured, how often, who, and where. So I think the definition is key here. It's like trying to make everybody as aware that short-term training means this, and agricultural training means this, and water quality means this. So it doesn't always have to be about people. Okay, so I wanted to go into ways that we can measure things. And here's a set of things, a set of tools, and I'm just gonna go over each one and then talk about the pros and cons of each one, because they definitely all have pros and cons. And I steal most of this from my own website, which I'll post, it's linked up here later. We have an integrated pest management impact assessment toolkit, and it's available, it's free, it's on the internet. We designed it because we felt like integrated pest management projects were really weak in the evaluation piece, and it's really critical to us that we show that integrated pest management works and that we can clean up the environment. And so this, when you go on there, the language is rooted in integrated pest management, but you could substitute in any topic for IPM, right? We don't go into like the measuring of insects or something. But so we've put it in a friendly language for our audience, but you can use it and it should make sense to you even if you don't know what IPM is. So, and in here we have a list of all of these methodologies, and we go into how you actually conduct each one, the pitfalls, where to get more resources. So it's it took them, it was before my time, but it took them years to do. So if we start with surveys, surveys are nice because you can get information quickly from a large group of people. And they're pretty easy, you know, I mean, you can give out a paper survey, you can do one over the internet, you can call people on the phone and survey them. There's a lot of different ways to do that. It also creates a record of respondents' input. So you could go to Carla's survey and you could do her post survey and compare her to herself. And if you design it well, then it's really easy to aggregate data over time. So you could have, maybe your program is always about environmental quality, and I do a survey of water, or a survey of the amount of pesticides people use. If I ask the same questions throughout time, I should be able to aggregate those questions. The disadvantages are that it's difficult to get an adequate response rate sometimes. So say your target audience is 100 people, but you only get 10 people to answer your survey. It's not very reliable for assessing the data. It's hard to know people's biases on collecting responses, and you've all seen those surveys that are like, strongly disagree, strongly agree, hate this. So if you get enough people to answer those questions, it kind of makes the data, takes the noise out of the data. But if you don't have very many people and they're all like super happy people, then, you know, everything might be strongly agree, and like if they don't like something, it might be just agree, right? Or there might be those people who are like, I hate all of this, but good for me is whatever. Like when I score, my poor students, tests, my test score, like, yeah, don't ask my undergrads, but they, so I tend to score tests really low. We make up for it in curbing, but, you know, and there's other people who tend to score things really high. And it's just, but if you can get enough people to take your survey, then, like I said, statistics will take care of a lot of that noise. You can throw out the outliers, those things. Your responses can really lack depth and detail because, again, you're doing something quickly and you aren't asking the why. You're asking what, but you're not asking the why. And some surveys give you limited opportunity for follow-up because you only have that audience captive for a little bit of time and then they're gone. Some people collect economic data as a way to assess their impact. So you might look at, well, food security data. You might look at how many fruits and vegetables are eaten in a community. That's an economic analysis. You might look at incomes of people. And economic analyses give you this opportunity to quantify changes in behavior in a standard way. So you can use income as a proxy or food security as a proxy. They help you, a good economic analysis, and I am not an economist, so we'll just not take any questions for a minute, but a good economic analysis can help you determine how much change is possible given available resources. So like, say, I've seen this done with labor. So if you only have so much labor available, you can do an economic analysis to understand how to capitalize and use as much labor as possible to be as efficient as possible. This is where you see formulas and things in economics. And they can help you understand if what you propose is worth, it will generate enough benefits to warrant the effort. So if you're only going to increase incomes by $1, but it's going to cost you $7 to do that, it might not be worth it, maybe.
So that was doing a cost-benefit analysis.
Cost-benefit analysis, yeah. The disadvantages are the economic analyses deal with real-world data, and those data are not always collected by the same people. So for instance, if I keep talking about food security, and the Food and Ag Organization has some really good data about how many fruits and vegetables and how much dairy and stuff are eaten. And but how reliable those data are is up for debate. In some countries, the United Nations feels like they have good data, and in some countries, I think they're just like shooting in the dark. So, and sometimes this is expensive. So it depends on, like, if there's already a data set. So in my field of study in education, we have a lot of good data sets on schools. And so if you can access those data for relatively little bit of money and do some analysis, then, so just think about what's out there. Focus groups are fun. So focus group is gathering together a diverse group of individuals and asking them questions. They can be less expensive than surveys because you're asking fewer people. And they can really reveal in-depth information more than a survey can about your behavior or attitude. If done right, they can capture group dynamics. So the goal of a focus group, and you could run it in a different way, several different ways. So in development, we often think about interventions for women and men. And so in those situations, I might run 3 focus groups, one for the men in the village, one for the women in the village, and then one for the men and women in the village, and then look at any differences between those two. Or if culturally appropriate, I would maybe have to start with the elders of a village or the religious leader of a village and do those people first and then move on. So they can stimulate brainstorming. I've seen a lot of fun focus groups, not just where you sit around a table like this and ask people questions, but where you show people things. Like, here's a photo of peanuts. Now let's talk about where peanuts are in your village. Or let's draw a map together of where people store things. Or let's draw a map of how people interact with each other. Yeah.
So we had Rob Davis come in.
Love him.
He talked about participatory learning approaches and like spatial mapping and walkabouts and using sticks and things to do stuff like that. So I think
that's essentially a focus group. Yeah. So as long as you wrote down all the answers to the questions.
How large would a focus group be compared to a survey? Because say you're working with 100 farmers, and like that could be perceived as a focus group because 100 is not really a large number of people, but like that's as large as your. So I guess like what's sort of the guideline between a survey focus group or even just like a group interview and sort of that.
So to me, a survey is very quantitative, and you don't get to go off on tangents like you could. So you could have 100 people in your focus group, but what you might want to do is just pick a subset of those people. So if 90 of them are women, you should make sure that 9/10 of your focus group are also women. And a focus group can give you data that then you could use to survey the rest of the people. Or maybe you had a survey and you're like, why did they all answer this? You can get a focus group into a room and figure out why people answered. So there's no reason why you couldn't do both, especially if your population is small. One really interesting thing is in a focus group, people play off of each other, and like you might say something and that will spur somebody else to think of something else. And so you can get some really rich data if you sit and be quiet and listen to people. Yeah.
So the focus group is a way to assess your output? Is that?
It could be to determine an output. So like,
so would you count the number of people that come to your focus group or something, I guess?
Or you could talk about the qualitative aspect of it. So through focus groups, we were able to determine that people really do care about climate change. And
so you can make some interpretations then.
Yeah, right. Disadvantages, the moderator can influence responses. So if I'm a woman in a group of men, then they might not share, or if I'm an older person or a younger person than they are, they might not share information as readily as an anonymous survey. They might not say what it is they really think because, you know, their boyfriend's sitting next to them, or their dad is sitting next to them, or some really mean dude is, you know, I don't know. And we shouldn't do that for sensitive topics. So we shouldn't talk about like domestic violence in a focus group. That would be very difficult to do. And it's very hard to generalize. So what you could do is you could use data from your focus group to make a survey and then generalize better from your survey. Secondary data is when there are other data that were collected for another purpose that you get to use again. And USAID has a lot of this data. They have done like country level assessments of women's empowerment. You could get those data. Like I said, in my world, we use school data. We could use environmental data. Using secondary data is inexpensive, and hopefully if that person did a good job, you don't have to worry about anything going wrong. It can add depth to your primary data and make it more generalizable. I don't use secondary data very often because I find that most of the projects we do are so local that it's hard to take somebody else's data set. But maybe, your goal is to keep people healthy, and so you could use external data that people gathered from the doctor, like how many people are going to the doctor reporting that they have migraines, and can I correlate that to something? Sometimes you have to pay for those data, and I would think twice and think really hard about whether those data add meaning to your study. All right. A case study is a really nice thing to do. So it's following one particular aspect of your research and seeing it through. So it might be looking at the lead farmer in your community and seeing why they do or do not adopt a technology, and then trying to ascertain. So what you'd be doing is watching them, doing observations. You would do interviews with the people. There's whole entire books about doing a case study, but they help you tell a nice story they tell the story behind the numbers. So then you can, like, if your intervention is to improve solar drying and your project had a really good track record of people adopting it, then you might use a case study to look further into why people adopted solar dryers and what the story is behind that, and what are the things that got in the way of people adopting it. This is expensive. A good case study is probably the most expensive thing that we do, because you have to be there throughout the whole time that somebody's participating in your project. You have to talk to them a lot. There's a lot of travel involved. And so doing a good case study can be expensive. Yeah.
Is there a scale? So like you mentioned, looking at the lead farmer and their involvement in the project. So I'm wondering if case studies are usually based on individuals or community level. Like how local does it need to be? Could you do a case study on like an entire country?
Most of the case studies I've seen are on the individual level, or a group of people, a small group of people doing something. Those are where you get the most powerful data. Yeah. But it does make it harder to generalize about them. You do see people analyzing an entire country and calling it a case study, but I feel like you have to do that for like the 60 years that you work, and even then. Then I would just call it an in-depth literature review. You can do interviews. This is my favorite thing, and that's just because these are the questions I know how to ask better. So the advantages of that over a survey is that you can ask follow-up questions. So if you're asking a question on a survey and somebody isn't clear, then you can ask it in a different way and get a different, So it gives you a little bit more flexibility. It allows the participant to use their own words instead of your words, which are the ones you put on a survey. And it makes it easier to write. When you write a survey, it's really important that you have a stakeholder take that survey and tell you what they think. You just ask them, right? To to ensure that what you're asking is, or the answers that you get are related to what you asked. And in an interview, you can tell pretty quickly if you've asked a question that didn't make sense. So they might give you some off-the-wall answer and you're like, I did not think about that. And so then you can explore it with them. My favorite thing about interviews is you could take a survey and the survey kind of tells you what's going on, and then you can go in and figure out why that thing is happening. It does require a lot of skill and experience. A good interviewer hardly ever speaks and tries really hard not to nod as people are talking, because people are encouraged by nodding and smiling. So you have to be, there's a lot of skill. If anybody listens to public radio, Terry Gross, she's like the best interviewer in the whole world. And, but she's been doing it for a long time. Yeah, they can be time intensive. So good interviews, so we have some ways of transcribing and analyzing qualitative data. We have deduce and in vivo. Deduce is free. And what those do is it takes a long time to do an interview, write down all the things the person says, and then analyze those in a way that is subjective. And too easily we can be swayed by the person who has the best personality and wanting to report what they said, when that might not be what everybody said, right? Social network analysis, this is all the rage in the evaluation world right now. I'm not into it yet, but I can probably be convinced. So in a social network analysis, you're trying to understand how people are connected and if you've increased the number of connections. And so when we talk about adoption of a technology, we might look at where people get information. So do you get information from the internet or from radio or from another person? And you really map it. So you map this network of dots and who gets their information where, and you try to look for patterns. And they have analysis tools to analyze the strength of each of the arrows. So it can help you with questions about social structure. So like who knows who? Like who is the big risk taker in your community? Like maybe that's the farmer that you need to adopt your technology. And so you could go through a village and you could ask people like, who is the first person to try this technology, who was the first person to get a cell phone? Who was the first person to get the new variety? And then you could focus your efforts on trying to get that person to do your technology. And it also can show the strength of different networks. So maybe the women in the village talk about different things than the men in the village. So these are quite intricate and really, if you Google it and do the image Google of social network analysis, you'll see some pretty cool things. And like I said, there are programs that help you analyze those data. What I see as a fallacy is that now that this is cool, everybody wants to do it for everything, but it really is about networks and interactions, and not every question pertains to an interaction. So here's my website, ipmimpact.ucanr.edu, and so it goes into great detail. So under surveys, we have like 6 pages of why you would do a survey and what would it look like and what makes a good survey question. And at what point in time should you freak out and call an evaluation specialist? And what should you ask them? What should you ask the monitoring and evaluation specialist to help you? So we've worked really hard on that. We also have a section on impact analysis and a section on logic models. So please use it. Just substitute in nutrition or post-harvest or whatever it is for IPM. we just wanted to make it friendly so that IPMers would use it. All right, so we talked about outputs and outcomes and qualitative and quantitative measures. I'm going to spend just brief time talking about facilitating an M&E workshop, and then we're going to dive into this template and we'll be done. So there are 2 guides, and I did send this to Asha so she could give it to you later. FSN Network, which is Food Security Network, they have a lot. If you just go to fsnnetwork.org, you will see so much information. Their task was to essentially aggregate information for people who do development. And they have a monitoring and evaluation facilitator guide. And it's quite good, and I stole a lot of the stuff that comes after this from there. And then there's this book. So Gene King and Stephen, they were kind of pioneers in the evaluation world, and they wanted to really professionalize evaluation. So they were the ones who came up with like our 9 principles of evaluation. And they have this really nice book that's about mastering interpersonal dynamics. So if you're working with a company or an organization, how you figure out what it is, how you get to what they really want to achieve, and then how you feed that into an M&E plan that works for them so that they can essentially take it and go. So move this down. So this is what King and Stephen say you have to be able to do. So the first one is that you have to get personal, all right? So as you're developing this M&E framework, it's really important to get to know people. And you might find that the first time you show your organization the framework you've developed for them, they might be like, oh, great, love it, done. And what you should do is be pushy and say, are you sure? You should take this home and chew on it. Like, I don't have to be right. You know, I did this and everything could be fixed, right? And so make sure to figure out what personally matters to them. And you might be having a conversation with your Trellis NGO, and they might say something that you're like, oh, that's what they really care about. Like, that's their end goal. So get very personal. In a workshop, it should be very structured so that people have positive interaction with each other and that they're not overwhelmed. Evaluation can be kind of overwhelming, and in this book, they have a lot of ways, games that you can play with each other. And there are things that that you probably learned already in this class, like, you know, like doing a dot survey where you have like a list of outcomes, and then people get to vote, right, on which outcome they want, or just trying to do stuff together. Good practices. You've all been in school, and some of your teachers are better than others. So think about the good teachers. You should be able to examine context. So you really want to spend a little bit of time understanding where you're going. And I'm sure you already did this because this is like week 7 or something. So, you know, getting to know the culture where you are, it can really influence the evaluation. I find that there's like these little cheesy cultural guides that you can get on Amazon, and they're totally worth it. So one day I was flying to Singapore, and I had brought UC Davis clocks as a gift to my person. And if you've been to Singapore, people from Singapore, if you give them a clock, it means they're gonna die. And
it's actually all of Asia pretty much.
Yeah, okay. Well, and so I had UC Davis clocks. And then on the plane, I was like, I should read about where I'm going because I've never been there before. And then I was like, shoot. And so they did not get UC Davis clocks. I brought them home and gave them somebody else. So yeah, so I think understanding the cultural context is, you should work really hard at that. Consider politics, and this can be internal politics. So you could be in an organization trying to help them plan their monitoring and evaluation, and there might be the CEO or the most vocal person, and everybody yields to that person, and everything inside of you is saying, oh, but that's not what I want to do, but you have to just go with it. If that person's in charge and you could never get around it, then you have to just go with it. But also you could probably sway that person and know that they're the influencer, right? So it can work both ways. You should expect conflict, and that's normal because not everybody's going to agree, and that's okay, and you just have to be able to walk them through that. We talked about culture there, and relationships take a lot of time. King and Stevens are really like anti wanting to, you know, be those kind of monitoring and evaluation people that fly in, give you your recommendation, and fly home. So that's from their book. This is how they kind of orient themselves. So if something's evaluator directed, it has very low involvement from participants. Does that make sense? And if something is very participant directed, then the role of the evaluator should be quite low. What they aim for is something in the middle where the evaluator is really part of the team and can help the whole project go better. This is the strategy that I use. If I, this is kind of, I would adjust this depending on where I'm going, but this is kind of the basic strategy that if an organization were to hire me to do monitoring and evaluation, this is what I would do, is I would go into that organization and I would sell monitoring and evaluation, because often they've just been told, like, you won't get this project unless you do a monitoring and evaluation plan, or, and that's mostly it. And
that's true for Trellis.
And that's true for Trellis. Right. So, but there are ways to sell evaluation that aren't punishing in nature. So that's the first thing I would do, is go in and give my spiel. You know, you could draw on, I sent you the Feed the Future rah-rah book. Yeah, Feed the Future snapshot. These are all the things that, I don't think she printed it for today because it's long, but these are the results of the data that they were able to collect. So everybody working on a Feed the Future project collected the same data. We didn't all collect, like there's 100 indicators, and like the Horticulture Innovation Lab collects 10 of them, and Catholic Relief Services project number X has 10 more of them. But together, added together, they tell stories, which are, we had a 19% drop in poverty and 26% drop in child stunting. And that's the power of monitoring and evaluation. If they didn't collect those data, then we would not know, right? So you have to cheer. That's the first thing. The second thing I do is do a needs analysis or a SWOT analysis, and you would have done those with Rob. God, I love Rob. And from there, you would have, and all of these feed into the log frame, right? And they all feed into the M&E framework. So there you would have ranked needs and come up with a plan and linked up objectives to the needs, looked at the inputs we have, developed more indicators, set up this data plan, then collect the data and analyze the data and give them back to the people. So if I was your consultant, that's what I would do. All right, so these are two resources I like. Interactive evaluation practice, this King and Stephen book has activities that you can do with organizations, and Liberating Structures is a facilitation guide. Liberating Structures is free and on the internet. You don't have to buy the book. So it's like liberatingstructures.org or com or something. Okay, so what you need for a trellis, and tell me if you feel like you've got it, is to understand your organization's goal. Does everybody feel good about what we got nods in the virtual world? Okay. And then develop outcomes that help you meet that goal. And some of them should have been outlined in the proposal from Trellis. Does anybody feel like they need help with those? Yeah, those were given too. So, and then develop the outputs to show that you've met the outcomes. How are you doing there?
But you don't mind if I jump in on this?
Yeah.
So I think a lot of us, or some of us, are focused on like sort of education type things, and I have a hard time, maybe these are all outcomes. So outputs would be like a way to assess knowledge gained or something. And so, I mean, I understand we could do the number of participants, how many, trainings I conduct and things like that. But then how do you, without being intrusive, I don't want to quiz my farmers, So we talked about focus groups or something like that where, hey, but how do you assess how much people understand about a new concept?
Yeah, so I mean,
am I going out?
No, you're fine. Yeah, just think about it the same way we would school, kind of. But so, I mean, you could assess adoption of a new concept by going out in the field and seeing how many people do that and how long it takes for things to adopt, right? Like, who's the first person to get a solar dryer, and how many dryers are there in the village? So that could be one way. That's
adoption of the practice.
That's adoption, but they learned it, right? So it's if they didn't do it before and you taught them something new and then they adopted it. Yeah. You could also do after class, after your trainings, you could have them fill out anonymous surveys if they can write. You could just do easy, like everybody show their, raise your hand if you know the answer to this question, or raise your hand if you now understand this better than before, or so it can be rough numbers of trying to understand. As a teacher, as you're giving a training, you want to always check in and see how people are learning things. And if you keep track of that formative assessment, like how many times did I have to go back and re-explain nitrogen analysis? Maybe I'm doing something that's a negative indicator. Like if I have to re-explain something over and over again, then I'm doing something wrong as a teacher.
Or I was thinking of like every section of because mine's mostly going to be like classroom, like finish the section and then have what's called a discussion, but you can include like questions that were more like quiz questions, but got them engaged and saw their answers. And then, you kind of anecdotally gauge how well they understand it based on the discussion and that kind of thing. And that's what I was thinking. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that would totally work. Or sometimes you see at the end of a training, like, now everybody put on a skit about this, or now you teach somebody else, right? And you can watch people teach other people and you can know if.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. Or we do this in school. We make you give presentations, right? Give a presentation about this. And we assess that. We have a rubric for assessing whether you got an A on that. So yeah, think about creative ways that you can measure learning. That's cool. You're doing a lot of trainings. The old Trellis students didn't get to do so much training.
Yeah.
Yeah. if you wanted something aggregatable, right, that's the number of people trained, or the number of people getting a certificate. And that over time, if you added that up to everybody else's, then you would have some impact. But if you're just looking at knowledge gained in a certain field, you know, like, do people do soil tests quicker than they used to, or yeah, is the math easier?
So when we fill this out, should we do it from our perspective, our organization community perspective? But obviously, our logic models are kind of a little different. Do training while they're trying to do a more complex. It should be one and the same, right? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they would have a different theory of change maybe for their organization, but for this project, it should be. So whatever you're filling out now, I mean, hopefully you're talking to them and it's informed, and then you can present to them and let them, you know, be very humble and tell them that you could even challenge them, find the thing that's wrong here, right? So that they don't feel like they're telling you something bad. Yeah, think about cultural norms, and like, they won't want, you're the student, they're gonna love you, like they aren't gonna want to tell you that you're doing something wrong. So say, my professor told me that something was wrong here, and I challenge you to figure it out. Yeah. So converting the log frame that you have to the M&E matrix, I think you should start here. So you have the goal of your logic model, and that obviously goes in the upper left-hand corner. And then you should have a list of outcomes, and you should have a list of outputs. And if your arrows, you know, we've given you a framework that works backwards, where you have like this output, and then it goes up into an outcome. So you might need multiple of these pages, right? So you might have an output that is number of people trained, and who will measure all of those things, and then what that means in terms of an outcome. But then you might have a totally different outcome in like number of vegetables dried, or output, number of vegetables dried, and that is better food security, you know? So you might end up with more than one of these sheets, or like they've done on the other side, they have multiple outputs leading to one outcome, which lead to the goal. Yeah.
In filling out my log frame, I felt like a lot of my activities were not necessarily numbers, but more like completion, like check off, did this happen or
That's
not?
totally fine. Yeah. So it can be a list of activities that you logically have to do in order to make. And we see that often, like, first step is we have to get people to come to the meeting, and the second step is we have to feed them, and the third step, and that's totally, so then your overall output would be completion of the series of activities, successful completion. Because if you were monitoring that, you'd want to make sure that each of those steps was followed. And if at one point in time you had to call an audible because one of the steps didn't work, then your monitoring and evaluation plan will help you.
I have a question. Is there a difference between, I mean, I guess there's a difference between activities and participation, but can you explain it, please?
Yeah, so participation are the people that are doing those activities. Yeah.
So that would be both like beneficiary, like farmers, but also maybe NGO staff people, or trellis students.
Mm-hmm. So it'd be all the people you need to do the activity. So the person measuring the data, whatever. Yeah. And not all logic models have the humans in there, but I find it's nice for planning to know. And it's nice to have the inputs, because you're not, you're like, well, I have computers and desks and chairs, and so then I can do these kinds of activities, and I need these kinds of people to do these activities. And if I have all of those things built, then I'll have this short-term outcome. So I only left us with 5 minutes, and I really intended to leave us with more. So how do you feel? So I think look at your logic model and circle where you feel like you need improvement, and double look at your outputs. Like, do they measure what you want to measure? Are they practical? Is there some way you could disaggregate them and make the data richer? And then has anybody tried to fit this into their M&E template yet? We got both sides, yeses and nos. It's totally fine. It's totally fine.
So for me personally, my outputs that I put are not very quantifiable, so I think I need to reassess that.
Good. That's good. That's
And is
okay.
that because the nature of the outputs are difficult to quantify, or?
You know, I just put activities as like things like trainings that I was going to do, and that's not
Without thinking about the measuring.
about not thinking like, okay, I need to assess like, you know, how many soil tests we do, or how many people come to the training, or you know, something like that.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mine are quantifiable. It's just my organization doesn't have the capacity to do some of those medium and long-term outcome assessments. Essentially,
Yeah.
they said they can't go ask every 100 or so farmers if they've adopted, you know, so I can't make, I don't want to make some assessment tool that forces them to fulfill it. So it's
Right.
mainly going to be like attendance records for me and that kind of thing.
So think about a proxy, like not just attendance records, but are they getting the right farmers in the meeting? Like,
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, what kind of farmers? Good, yeah. Like asking the farmers if they already have vegetables or they already use mulch or something like that.
Right. Like, yeah, what if they already do? What if all the farmers who come are so-and-so's brother-in-laws and they all do that practice already? And you look like a rock star, but you haven't. Yeah. So there's ways to tease that apart. So how do people feel? Like, raise a finger if you don't have fingers, you know, like, I feel great about my logic model and I only need somebody to look at it once, or I'd feel better if we could spend more time, or OMG.
We have 2.5.
Yeah, I'm at
2.5. Online, we've got 2s.
I would like 3 hours with my
Yeah, me too.
We got 1.5. Oh, we got a 1. Go, Krishna. There you go. Okay, so let's see. What I would like to offer you is that I'm here for, there's not that many of you. There's like 12, 15. No problem. Mm-hmm. So if you want to email me your stuff, that's cool. If you live here and are willing to come to my office, which is over by Target, you can come. For those of you who are offline, I have Zoom and I can send you a note, and I'm totally available. I am not available today and tomorrow, but after that, and Monday's a holiday, so I'm not doing it then. But I'm in the office all week next week, and I'm happy to spend half hour with you. But please, before you email or call me, do these things. Like, look at your logic model, figure out which pieces could be more clear, and look at your indicators and take a stab at that, and then take a stab at fitting it into your framework. So, and then Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just have a question I think might be relevant for everyone in terms of, I really like King and Stevens' principles for working with an organization, but I feel like a lot of the suggestions are very difficult when you're remotely communicating. Like if we were able to sit in a room with an organization and like really workshop some of this stuff, like, that would be so easy and great. I just don't, I wonder if you have suggestions for how we can adapt their principles for pretty much doing all of this M&E development work before
you get there.
Yeah.
Well, so are you able to Skype? Are you Skyping with them, or are you? No, you're all doing email kind of stuff. Okay.
Mixed. Like I was able to Skype with mine, but like voice only.
Voice only. Yeah. So you might send this. You could send them a list of questions still using the King and Stevens kind of stuff. Like, what are your, you could do a SWOT analysis without you being there. Like, what's your strengths and what's your weaknesses? And, you could also really, like you had just said, somebody online had just said, well, this organization can't possibly interview these farmers, right, or all of the farmers, because it's too expensive. So, what you have now, you should be able to, the pieces that you need to clarify, you should be able to email them and clarify them, or call them. And
do you recommend having them fill out one on their own and then
no,
or just going at it collaboratively from the start?
Yeah, collaboratively is better because people are very overwhelmed by monitoring and evaluation, and it's very scary. And so even though we've made this it feels very clear, these words are they're foreign without being in a different language. So I think it's better to find the missing pieces and reframe the question in a way that is easier. Because I feel like if you have them unless they have a log frame and they have a theory of change and they're just like the most advanced organization ever, but the organization I work for didn't have a log frame until I got there. So then it would be too much to start from their scratch. Yeah. But they should definitely, you don't want to dictate this to them. So it's kind of like, is this okay? From what you've been telling me or what I read in the proposal, I think you could do this. Do you think that you could do this? Or you could give them an option. I think there's 3 things we could do. Which of those do you think is the best? And remember, you're only there for a little bit of time. And so you want to give them quality data that they will know that they did a good job with whatever they had proposed, and that they could use those data. Trellis is about organizational development. So they could use those data that in the next grant proposal to Trellis, they could say, last time you gave us money, we trained 42 people and those people learned this thing. You want to inspire them to write the words that are in this fancy thing. Yeah. Cool. Well, it's too. Oh, hey, I love it. We got 2 more minutes. Stupid clock. There's a clock up here. You guys just don't see it, and it's fast. You're welcome. And I'm here. Trellis was started by my student Peter, who I love and adore more than anything in the world. And so anything I can do to help Peter's legacy, I'm in. Yeah.
I just have a couple announcements for next week. Can people online hear me okay? Yeah, okay, thank you. So next week, we are going to be joined by a couple of PIs from the Horticulture Innovation Lab who have a post-harvest project in Rwanda, and they're going to go through with us how to plan and deliver a workshop or training. There might be some homework for that, but they haven't sent it to us yet, so I'll send an email by the end of this week with things to do to prep for next week. Most of you have sent me your travel dates If you haven't and you have an idea of when you're going to be going, please let Asha and I know by emailing us. And yeah, don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions or if anything is unclear. And thank you so much, Amanda, for joining us. It's really great.
No problem. Thanks. And those of you who are not here don't know that I'm interviewing for a job today, so, and they made me come here.